Welcome everyone. I wanted to wrap up this build series for the 1973 International Harvester Scout II with a kind of a walk around to explain some of the details that went into the truck, go over some of the features, and just kind of general talk about this. So with that, we'll just jump right in. So starting off at the front, just right here at the bottom, it's a steel bumper, and this was a little bit difficult to build. The construction is fairly simple. It's just tapered up, it's tapered back, give it a little bit of a little more of a sleek design, capped ends. So that's not very difficult, but the hard part was getting it mounted. Typically, I would build these and mount them down the side with tang or some type of a support structure coming off, quite similar to other bumpers you might see on the market. But for this one, I was trying to get it as close as possible to have access for mounting a three racing winch or some other similar type of winch setup, without having just massive amounts of holes in the bottom, cutting it all up. And what I ended up coming up with was a thick steel plate on the bottom, mounted up into the aluminum cross brace that comes stock in this RC4WD Gelande edition. The top, I mentioned before, has the three racing winch or any other kind of similar winch mount, but that is mounted separate to the bumper. You can kind of see where it's cut in right here. So the nice part about it, once you put your winch in, your bumper in separately, you can, with drilled and tapped holes, use some small metric screws to mount the plate down, and then from underneath use the screws to mount it to the winch. And the winch will sit right in here, well protected by this bash bar. The grill, when I was looking at the Scout II, I noticed that there was just quite a number of grills. There's horizontal and vertical, and it doesn't seem to be one consistent approach to that. And I'm not sure if it's over the years or if just mismatched or that's the way they came. But I found one similar to this, and I figured this would be a pretty interesting look, and it would be relatively easy to do. So these are all hand cut. I drilled holes top and bottom, and then cut each one in between, and then hand carved and sanded this down to get these all even. The slats at the bottom are a little more difficult. I ended up cutting these with a Dremel tool and hand cut them across each one. They're not perfect, but you know, most of that will be covered up with the winch, and I think it looks pretty good. Recessed marker lights, and these are just headlights. You know, you see a typical axial kit or something along that lines. What's unique about these is, if I'll get a little closer, is I made a bezel ring, and I chromed that with liquid chrome, this Molotov. I essentially took a piece of plastic. It's expanded PVC is what this whole truck's made out of. I took a chunk of that plastic, stuck it on the end of a Dremel, spun it up, and used a small file to almost lathe in or carve in a recessed area, cut in the details, and made that where it would fit the lens and accept the lens, and then have a detailed chrome bezel. Quite similar to the original Scout. Go down the side. It's kind of a plain looking truck from the side. It's just kind of flat, and there's not a whole lot of details. It's got a body curve that kind of starts at the top, flat in the middle, and then curves back down. So the trick was trying to get something interesting looking without having a whole lot of detailed body lines. So I got the windshield and window. I do have the window rolled down. and getting in to use some of that chrome paint and some tape, and taped off an area where I made it look like it had a chrome edge around the top. Added in some 3D printed details where the handles, those are again in the chrome. Not exactly the same handles as on a Scout, but very similar. I decided, instead of going with something that could potentially break off, I went with the rubber mirror, but was able to find out that if you take that chrome paint, it holds up very well on these rubber mirrors, and it gives you an effect that is pretty close to a mirror, and it's actually pretty nice scale detail to that. The sliders are just a simple tube design. They're mounted with more tube to a flat plate that's then bolted to the chassis. Not a whole lot there, but it gives a lot of good structural support going over the rocks. Protrudes out just enough to where it'll catch before the door and add a little bit of protection. Speaking of the doors have body lines cut in, which is nothing more than taking a file and slowly working a groove into the plastic. I got marker lights front and back. The one thing I don't have on this yet is it's a Rally Edition Scout, and that has a stripe that comes down and goes the length of the truck all the way back to right about where this body line is here, and then finishes off right up here on the taper of the hood. And I will put a picture of that right up here. So that is being made, and then we'll get here eventually. It'll come right underneath here. I can pull these two pieces out, put it down, pop these back in after they're done, and then that'll be the final. The wheels I'm running, I think just have a good fit for the truck. It looks pretty good. They're just plastic wheels, but I sprayed them with an actual automotive wheel paint. It was very durable paint, and the tires are the Mud Thrashers from theirs. So pretty decent tire. Probably not the best thing in the world, but I think that they look really good. They're good for scale. Fits the era. I was going for it's a 1973, so I was going for a 80s era truck, and I figured that's probably a good, something you might have back then. Going on to the rear, starting at the bumper. Again, went with a pretty simple bumper. It does protrude out the back, a little step area. It's a little thinner than the front bumper, and it's again tapered, and just to give it a little bit of interest. But this way is straight across, so it doesn't taper in. It just tapers up on the ends, and that is mounted to some rods and then bolted right into the back chassis for the Gelande. So it's very, very good solid mount for that. The tailgate is actually one of the most interesting parts on here. It's got a reset with these little raised panels, and what this would be the door handle, the push button to get the thing. I think this might be the light too. I'm not really sure. Tail lights. These are very similar to the tail lights that the Scout would have. As you might be able to tell, these are the RC4WD Drive Mojave, or even the Tamaya. I forget which ones they actually are, but they're trimmed down slightly to fit better with the look, and painted with some automotive taillight paint to give them that red. It's kind of a little bit darker red than I was looking for, but there's no light source in the back to kind of shine through. Just made up a quick little license plate, very simple license plate maker, and obviously the Westmade sticker that goes in the back. So you can see that. I try to get that on all my builds. Again, around to this side, very similar. The only other difference is there's a chrome gas cap right there for gas filler neck, and the rest of it looks pretty similar. Coming up on top, if I can get this down, cutting these vents, I was really stressed about trying to cut those vents and figure out exactly how I wanted to do that. thought about several different ways, and what I ended up doing was just taking a lot of time and care and hand carve those in with using a ruler and one of the microfiles. Just kept working my way down to it. Again, that's like the grills in the front. They're not perfect, but they do add a little bit of good detail. Some scale wipers to go up here, and then that kind of rounds out the outside. So one of the interesting things about the Scout in this build is that the hood actually opens backwards. So that's a interesting thing, I thought. And I decided to go ahead and put a prop rod. It's a little small metal piece bent, and it's caught in here when it's down. You pop it up. It's got a little notch to slip into right there and holds the hood up nicely. So under the hood, I put in the substructure under the hood, which really turned out a lot better than I thought it was going to. So I think that adds a lot of good detail when the hood's up instead of just being plain. And then there's the engine bay itself. So this is half engine. The motor isn't exactly centered. It's a little bit over to the left, off-centered a little bit, which is why when I made this engine cover for the motor, it had to be a little wider than what I would like. So it should be a little bit narrower, but I still think it ended up being okay. Have the brake booster and cylinder, some little metal tubing I put down. It's the catch can and just tiny wire running around to give a little feel that this, the overflow. Battery with battery cables. This is the washer fluid tank. It's really hard to tell, but I got a little bit of a scale detail where it looks like there's washer fluid in there with some paint detail. Not my strong suit, but did the best I could with that. I believe this is some kind of emissions canister, vacuum canister of some sort. And this is the heater blower. So this is water that will be coming from the water pump. You see the water line is just a silicone. It's a silicone hose, but what this really is just it's like a 12 gauge silicone wire, and I have, this was glued on 6mm tube on each end, so I just able to shove that in each end with some super glue, and it held pretty well. The detail you really can't see is crazy. I spent so much time on it, but there's fins cut into the radiator. There's a full radiator fan, and you might be able to see some of the pulleys, which are like hair tie, rubber band hair tie type things. Again, cut all that using a similar process when making the headlight bezels. I took plastic onto a Dremel and spun it up, and almost had a lathe effect with a file to cut and shape pulleys and fan mounts, and then cut the guards and stuff. So also was able to make items such as the carburetor inlet filter housing, distributor, power steering pump, and alternators over here. One of those made this very similar. This is again just wire, very small gauge wire. I had some kind of a little USB or some kind of a power supply type that I was able to harvest all these little small wires out. They turned out pretty decent. And the last little one right here is I just a little bit of detail is actually where the sprayers go. They actually go into here on the real one and peek up through one of these two slots to spray water up on the windshield. So that's what that's supposed to be. So that's the engine. And like I said, there's a half engine because underneath would be the real drivetrain. This pops down into the little holder there, and magnets and secure the hood very well, so when you roll over you won't have any issues. So one of the other things I needed to do was find a way to access the battery. So when I made and cut this top, I cut it in a way that has what I had Velcro, And so you could pull this top up and then have access to the back. And the back seat, not exactly the easiest to get out. It's a little bit tricky. Not too bad. The back seat actually has a hollow spot inside of that. That hollow spot will be able to hold your battery, which would then be Velcroed or secured down to that spot right there. Also, a spare tire mounted in the back, which is the stock location for where the spare tire will go. Got little slats in the back for the pickup bed. Now, the interior is going to be very hard to see, but it has 1970 era bucket seats, door cards. I have the felt I used for a carpeting to line the floor, and also a thin rubber mat for a floor mat. Like I said, you probably won't be able to see much of any of that, but I'll have some pictures up in the end. The dash is cut very similar to it, and it has a unique part of the dash. Instead of having round gauges, it has the 1970s style elongated. So I was able to take and find some pictures of those and get those made into some stickers, and you really get in there and look at the detail. You can see it's got the radio, it's got the speedometer, it's got the temp, got the oil pressure, and so forth and so on, and along with 2 gear shifters in there. Now, the last would be the drivetrain. Let me see if I get it right here. Based off of RC4WD Gelande II, and for the most part, all of that has stayed the same. The rear links have been shortened just a little bit, and I did that by changing out the link ends for some little bit shorter link ends. I was off on the wheelbase by just a small bit, so that was able to take care of that. In order to get the height, I actually designed and built a cantilever system. So for those who haven't worked those before, it actually works fairly well. That gives you a small shock that runs along the chassis. It has a Traxxas style front end lever and a small little arm that comes down, and then that's what pushes up, and it actually works fairly well. Some people might not be fans of that, but I've used this a lot and found that it gives you all the movement and clearance, and really doesn't have any problem with that. The front pretty much has stayed the same, the way it comes from the factory, and the biggest difference is going to be the main drivetrain part. Is I actually used a regular RC4-wheel drive transfer case, but I replaced the front transmission with a Team Rafico transmission. So it's a planetary gear setup. If you not familiar with this, it's essentially a device is about the size of a 540 can motor. The 540 can motor bolts right to the back of the planetary gear, and off of that comes a drive shaft that goes into the transfer case and then splits off for your axles. I hope you have enjoyed this series. It's been a lot of fun. Did this as a documentary. I'm going to be starting a new series soon, and it's going to be a little bit different style. Instead of just a straight up documentary showing it from the beginning to the end, it'll be highlights, specific areas that might want to cover more detail. If everything works out well, we have multiple shots and different angles, as well as a little bit of voiceover to help explain the process through. So anyway, thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed. Please like, share, and subscribe. And we'll see you on the rock.